I would like just to start saying, reflecting how this year has deeply changed much of our life's routine and habits. Less than a year ago, we were living in a very different world. We might even not remember how different it was, but much of what we took for granted has changed in a rather sudden way. Taking a bus, taking a plane, traveling, dining out, hugging each other, even shaking hands. Actually, here in Chile, I have now introduced the Indian way of greetings, which is COVID say. So I don't say namaste, but everything else, I do it. And we are all aware that from a medical point of view, the biggest risks actually are for the elderly populations and people with previous conditions. However, the one most affected by this pandemic in the physical and emotional development are the children. Again, not so much in terms of consequences from catching the virus, but due to the many implications that comes with this. Just for instance, think about school. Globally, over 1.6 billion children are out of school, and they've been affected by the closure of schools in 192 countries. These consequences of this pandemic, the consequences are showing in many different and unexpected ways. We know that obesity, for instance, increases the risk of those contracting the virus, but at the same time, we know that one of the major consequences of the lockdown is actually obesity in children and in other segments of the populations. The lockdown also affects the emotional development and socialization skills of children, especially of the younger ones. And nobody knows for sure what will be the long-term effects of this situation on children's life once the pandemic will be over. Available evidence in Chile and in other countries show that obesity and mental issues in children have increased sharply during the pandemic. And the education inequality gap has also further widened, with children from the vulnerable segments of society not having been able to take equal advantage from distance learning due to a number of factors and causes, from poor connectivity, not having tablets or computers, insufficient teachers training to adapt and adopt the online curriculum. We also know from past evidence from the Zika, SARS, Ebola outbreaks that usually in this situation there is a sharp increase in gender-based violence and violence against children, and the same we expect unfortunately to occur with the COVID-19, even if reliable data are difficult still to obtain. So what can be done to improve the situation and mitigate the risk, and who can be involved in the efforts to mitigate this risk for children? Let us start from highlighting what has shown not to be particularly effective, and that is information campaigns. It's the easiest things to do, and yet it's a one that usually doesn't work that much. Especially now, where all over the world we're seeing how the distinction between facts and fictions has blurred. The distrust on traditional messengers and messages is so spread out that fake news are considered real for large segments of the population. It is not the evidence-based rigor of science or the reporting based on verifiable sources that makes many people believe if certain information is true. It is the ideological framework that persons hold that make them discriminate what is true and what is not. And I wonder how different is this from the information propaganda machinery of dictatorship of the past. The pandemic negative effects on children are affecting many of the sustainable development goals. But I would say that they could all in certain way be contained in one, SDG 10, reduced inequalities. And this applies both to inequalities within a country and among countries. Recent studies have highlighted the pandemic as severely affected achievements we were making against extreme poverty. We are expected to go back to rates of poverty we had 50 years ago worldwide. So all the advance we made this year, they might be wiped out and we might go back dramatically. Entire groups of population will fall into poverty, while others will see the standard of living falling sharply. And some, the most vulnerable, will be most affected. And children are the ones most affected within the vulnerable segments by the burden of this situation. There is no magic formula or one-size-fits-all recipe to mitigate the effects of this situation. And every country has a different socioeconomic situation and different capacity. However, I would like to highlight a general planning blueprint that could serve as a guideline in helping identifying, addressing, and mitigating the most pressing challenges for children, which are multidimensional. It is actually a model I've been working on, and I start thinking about when I was in India, where we actually worked a lot on the social ecological model. And this is a bit an adaptation of that. This intends to, it is composed by 3 dimensions, of which are the context, which are needed to create a conducive environment where change will happen at the individual level, which is where the sort of behavior change communication is actually more important. The dimension defining the social economical environment then are the public policy dimension that we see up, which addresses policy and budget needed to address the change. The organizational dimension, where public and state institutions, civil society organization, church organization, private sectors, academic centers and foundations can actually help and have a mandate and capacity to promote the change. And the third is a socio-cultural dimension that deals with existing norms, with media that can shape those norms, and other people-based networks. And this is where community engagement is key. Let me now try to link some of the key action required to mitigate the impact on the pandemic on children. The public policy dimension, for instance, would need to focus on measures by the state to actually help these segments. And since the economic one, it's one of the most serious negative effects, the state must plan and help with definite measures. So far, in Chile, like in many other Latin America and I think worldwide countries, for instance, there has been made some emergency cash transfers. There were policy and regulations made for deferral of due payments for rent or mortgages, to provide food baskets to poorer family, safety nets for workers losing their jobs, and other issues, especially because the decrees that imposed lockdown and quarantine made a lot of people lose their livelihoods. In the organizational dimension, school closings are the one that are affecting children in many ways, well beyond the instructional factor. Children in poorer households have been affected because of, as we said, lack of connectivity or overcrowding, and staying at home has also affected children in many other ways. Schools are also a place where to socialize and have emotional skills developed. They also serve as early warning system in case of domestic violence, something that cannot be monitored effectively when everybody is constrained in the limited space of the same households. In many countries, public schools also serve the main meal for many children who come from vulnerable households and emotional, and have an emotional impact. I remember, here in Chile we have a program for the main meal, but I know in India you have it too. I still remember once going with some of my staff in, I think it was in Bihar, in one of the schools, and sitting with the children to have them to share the meals. They invited me there. Incredible experience. And I was amazed also how spicy it was, despite it was 8-9 years children, and I really suffered. And the children seems to have a very good time to see me becoming all red. But the food impact is another one in vulnerable segments. The third dimension refers to social cultural norms. that can facilitate or impede change. In Latin America, for instance, we have hugging, kissing, shaking hands, and all this had to suddenly stop. Grandparents cannot hold their nephews, and in some cases cannot even see them directly. Keeping physical distance due to the virus meant changing norms and habits that we hold for hundreds of years. And the adoption of new norms and rules would have been expected to be held by media, relevant networks, and influencers, even though it's not always been the case. This is where community engagement must play a big role. And we know, and Vina knows it very well as well, that to support change, the best way is not vertical communication, it is dialogical communication, engaging in dialogue, participation, and engage different groups of people. Unfortunately, all this has been made more difficult by the spreading of fake news and the complex media landscape, social media especially, that we are living. And this three dimension briefly highlighted what is needed to be in place for then going and trying to apply and work on the individual dimension, where we provide knowledge, engaging dialogue, working on the attitudes, but we know that to be sustainable, such change cannot be imposed or just achieved through dissemination of information, but must be fully understood, discussed, and accepted by individuals. And this is why participatory communication becomes key. COVID-19 is affecting all the countries of the world and the people of the world, but it is not affecting people in a similar way. It is affecting people in a disproportionate, unequal way. And the ones paying a higher price are those at the bottom of society. And within those most affected, children are always the ones paying the highest price. As the effects of the pandemic is not affecting just their present situation, but also their future. So that's why I always focus a lot. And when I go and present SDGs, I always say the heart to me of all SDG is this one, is reduce inequalities. Because if we reduce inequalities, everything else will be improved. How can we do this? Of course, communication alone is not enough, yet it is necessary. And I have identified here three strategic lines. The first one is about advocacy with policy and decision makers in order to pass and implement specific measures and interventions aimed at mitigating the negative effects of COVID-19 repercussion on children, and guarantee that their rights, from education to safety, from violence, from health to play, and more, will be guaranteed. The second is communication. I put monological and dialogical. You can call it one-way and two-way communication. Strategies to address actions with selected audiences aimed at improving children's lives and protect their rights. So here you can address public opinion in general, but also you need to address specific audiences. Can be teachers, can be mother-in-laws, extensionist, health promoter, depending from what you want, but having an engagement with them about what needs to be done to mitigate and make sure that these inequalities do not get bigger. And the third, which is also usually very much neglected, and we are working hard here in Chile, it's what I call the empowerment communication, to engage children in decision-making processes affecting their lives. By empowerment communication, I mean genuine participatory communication. When children, adolescents, here we have formed an alliance for adolescents' participation in a process leading to new constitutions. And we are not trying to bring the voice of children. We are not going to be the intermediary. We actually have put children, adolescents, as a constituency in the governance of our alliance. They speak for themselves. We don't speak for them. And I think it's key because they're, as I said, they're present, but as well their future is at stake here. So children are very much capable of articulating what they want and what they need. You know, I'm not saying they should decide everything, but I say they should be partners in the decision making. And I remember, again, a nice experience I had when I was in India, where I met some of the children that were actually being received and informed like a local parliamentary constituency to present what were their needs. I think this is it's a right way to go. These strategic lines is something that are needed because communication is, as I said, it's key to push for a change. But we need to have all the other things in place. We need to have, to make sure that the policy environment of a country is conducive, and that's why we have the advocacy. We need to make sure that the institutions which are at work, institutions from ministries, line ministries, civil society organizations, and the like, are also supporting what needs to be done. And finally, we need to make sure that children are part of it. And in an unequal society, the implication of such pandemic will lead to further increase in inequalities. And what worries me is the increase of violence for children. I've seen firsthand when I was living and working in India, for instance, the suffering of too many children, violence, social, psychological and physical violence, trafficking, child marriage. How much of all this would have been increased during the pandemic? We know that in Latin America, it has increased. We have already data. We don't have definite data, but all this of the violence is like a pandemic within a pandemic. So if there is something that we are learning from this pandemic, is a need for dialogue as a way to take difficult decisions, assess the situation, and getting the needed support from the population, and requires also children participation. And the deterioration of the socioeconomic environment in virtually all countries of the world are likely to hit harder the poorer and most vulnerable population. And among them, again, children will be disproportionately affected. That is why we need communication strategy helping to ensure that mitigating measures will be in place and by decision makers with the support of the public at large. Children cannot be the ones paying the bigger price for this pandemic. This is not only ethically and morally wrong, but will also have long-lasting consequences for the future of our world, or better, their world. Communication alone cannot avoid that the inequalities gap for children widens, but it is, if used strategically, communication can help to reduce this gap. Thank you very much.